Well, hello, hello, hello. How's everyone doing out there? All right, let's get everything under control here. If I get a quick note in the chats, how are the audio levels for folks? So we did a little playing with that this week. If they sounded a little low to me, a little hot to me last week, and so if you kind of give me a thumbs up, thumbs down, how that sounded to you, and we will kick this show on the road. All right, cool. All right, hey guys, how's everyone doing? Welcome to the third of 3 parts. God knows I don't want to do a 4-parter in any time soon of anything. Talking about comics and restoration and signatures and grading and all these sorts of things. So this show is going to be focusing on the question of grading, pressing, restoration, signatures, slabbing, and essentially what are we all doing when we're doing all these things, and how does it affect your values on everything. Let me just do a quick check of the chats here before we get going. Of course means I gotta put my glasses on, so we got what we got. Alright, so let's see here. Oro, I will see if I can, let's see if it's showing up on my, gotta switch the keying on. Has a question about sources about offering classes, seminars, etc. to learn restoration theory. I'm going to point to some things. I posted some stuff in the notes already that will actually, I found pretty interesting going through cleaning and restoration types of ideas. And I'll also talk about a conversation I had earlier today with a guy who does pressing and such for a living. I'll talk about that in a bit. Hopefully that'll help you. If not, check the show notes after the show. Hopefully that will be useful to you. Greg says, hi from New Jersey. It sounds like everyone has beautiful weather today. This is just great. It's also gorgeous out here in Franklin. Yeah, we're going to get about 4 more good weeks of stuff before everything turns hellish and goes to winter, but you've got to enjoy these beautiful days out here where everything is 72 and sunny, and the humidity hasn't, humidity's finally giving you a break. There's actually a breeze in the wind. This is beer on the deck time for sure. So anyway, all right, let's see here. Or says hi from Minnesota. Mike grew up in Oroville. All right. And Andre, hello from Quebec. Nice. All right, better than the low levels 2 weeks ago. Interesting. I didn't know about that. Okay, audio sounds good. All right, so let's hit the road on this one. So, just a brief note of what I've been up to this week. It's been actually a really big week in terms of programming and things like that for me. Some stuff that I will be sharing with you all pretty shortly. Not going to get into the details of today, but it was one of those times when you're facing a deadline and you really need to have made progress over a weekend, and thank goodness actually made that kind of progress over the weekend. We knocked out some big stuff that we really had been on our to-do list for years. I mean, literally years. And I'm really excited to, some of the stuff is starting to take shape, and I'm really looking forward to showing it off to you in a little bit. Anyway, other things that's going on, variant analysis. Interesting stuff. I got a follow-up call from a gentleman who did a long-form article on variants in the comic industry several years ago. He looked at us for more data on the composition of variants, how many variants are going up over time and such like that over the years, and we did a deep delve into the ComicBase data to get him his data for his article. I will share some of that with you guys probably next week. I don't want to jump his article because it's pretty cool to see what he's got to say about the whole thing. But I will certainly point to his article as soon as it's published. But I'll give you a little bit on the raw data on that one next week. But we did a lot of analysis on that one. The short version of the story is, if you thought it was bad before, oh my goodness, it's so much worse now. And we'll give the specifics on that later. Other than that, the random stuff in my week. As you guys know, I've been trying to fill in that set of Eaglemoss graphic novels ever since I turned down to that deal with Zavi a while back. I will be showing you the status on that one again next week, because I'm getting really close to filling out the set, and it's that part where you're trying to pick up the last few books, and I actually had to make a order in from England directly from Eaglemoss. The good news is I caught a sale and the prices were good. The bad news is the shipping, as you can imagine, was hellacious. But the other good news is I actually got my first experience with a shipping forwarding service, a place called Forward to Me, which apparently the deal is basically gives you a virtual address out in this case, England, where Eagle Moss would free ship my books, because I qualified for free shipping to them, and they actually shipped it to me for a tiny fraction of what it would have cost me to ship the same amount of weight to England. It was probably a quarter of what that was, because one of the things about foreign shipping that's really striking, and this impressed me the first time I made the first deal with Zavvi, is that if I want to ship a DVD or something that weighs like 4 ounces to England, it's going to cost me a minimum of 14, 15 bucks just to stick it in the envelope and heave it off to them. But due to the way that DHL works, if you are just a really, really heavy shipper with them, so if you're shipping thousands and thousands of packages a year, they will cut you rates on international shipping that are apparently so economical that Zavvi, which is a online collectible service, can afford to ship me each of the 4 DVDs I ordered as part of their 4 for £50 deal in a separate envelope for like it looks like it cost them about $2 or $3 each to ship them to me, which is just astounding. I'm amazed. If we could get that kind of competition going the other way on shipping rates, it would be such a game changer for things like Atomic Avenue, in terms of international shipping. But I'll share some of my experience with that. Funny thing though is when Zavvi did not Zavvi, but when Eagle Moss did send me the big order of books that I'd gotten, I'd got most of the set at this point. Still a few oddballs I'm gonna have to pick off some kind of eBay or some online seller of one sort or another. They actually overshipped the order. They accidentally shipped me the whole thing more than twice. So they shipped me like the 20 books I ordered, and then like the same ones again, and then 3 more copies of extras from the same set. So the ginormous box behind me is going back to England as soon as they tell me that they're approving me to reimburse for the $114 it'll cost me to ship it back to them. On the other hand, I guess if they won't approve me for that, maybe they'll let me give them away as giveaways or something. I don't know. We'll find out. But if that box is still here next week, it's probably going to be free prizes for some kind of contest we'll do. So we'll find out. Anyway, so that's the news from my end. Let's get on to the regular part of the show. A quick check of the chat. Okay, Chrysov Infinite Godzilla's Part Infinity. Did I buy all the Eagle Moss Star Trek compilations? Scott asks. Sorry, let me get to the part where I can do that. I gotta say, no, I didn't do that because I'm just not that huge of a Star Trek fan. I mean, I like the show, but I didn't love the comics all that much. Everyone's into their own thing, so I didn't go into it. But the Star Trek compilations from Eagle Moss, as you guys probably know who like these things, there's I want to say 50 volumes of those now because they've been collected into comic form so much. And if you have the spines of them all arranged on your bookshelf, they also make a beautiful scene if you put them all together. So yes, we're in the year 2020 and we're doing that thing where our parents would buy the set of encyclopedias at the local grocery store and buy a new volume every week, just like the 70s. So this is where we are now, and what the heck. Welcome to 2020 once again. All right, so on to this. Okay, so as you guys remember, the whole thing started out a while back with me ranting about a thing where CGC was doing a signing with a guy named Joy Von Wade, who plays Cyborg in the HBO version of Doom Patrol, which again is not actually, Cyborg is in Teen Titans, he's not actually in Doom Patrol in the comics. And my beef with this originally was that they were charging up to $230 to get him to scribble on your comic. They would then stick it in a slab with a yellow sticker on it that said, yep, that really is him signing it, and it really is your comic that you sent us, and for $235 we will now, you can now mail it back to yourself. And I was like, oh man, this is like 20 kinds of wrong, and I tried to explain why this was in the previous 2 podcasts, which if this sort of thing excites you, then certainly I would refer you to those long digressions on it. What I want to get into this time, though, is the whole idea of that we are now engaged in what effectively can only be called manufacturing our own collectibles out of the raw material, which is comics. But it started out, I'm going to say, somewhat innocently. And so I want to kind of, take it all back a ways. And one thing I really appreciate about doing the show is that I found it, as a guy who writes software for a living and fills comic orders and does goofy things like this, yes, this podcast is the thing that allows me to struggle with the great philosophical, questions of our age. In the last week or two, I've had to struggle with, axiology and, whether there is such thing as a good which can't be bought, or whether inherent value is all a myth, etc. Yeah, this is the sort of thing I really appreciate about you guys, so appreciate that. And also, for whoever got, when I apparently just dropped the line ex cathedra, the other day, and someone actually in the chat translated it. I gotta say, I'm impressed. I have some of the smartest viewers on YouTube right now, so well done you. Anyway, so one thing I want to not get into too much is I realize is I'm sort of running through the whole show in my head, which, believe it or not, I actually do to try to argue the points with myself ahead of time. So I say only spontaneous things that are stupid, not things that I meant to say ahead of time that are stupid. So one of the things I was realizing is that just like any story involving yourself is always really interesting, any old historical story involving yourself is fascinating to yourself, which is why old people are so insufferable. Because they will always be like, I remember back in 1973 when this happened, and let me tell you about that. And it goes on forever, and you're like, yeah, Grandpa, what the? Anyway, I'm going to try not to make this one of those. But I do want to back up the story to how we got into the whole idea of comics and grading to start with. So, look, comic books. We all like comic books for whatever reasons. They've got great stories. They have, great covers or art, whatever the thing is, we like comic books. And we all started picking them up and collecting them. And at some point, someone said, well, okay, that one that my friend has that's been wadded up in the back of his pocket all summer, and that he occasionally would, like, chuck across the street and let his cat, play, his dog would play fetch with it or whatever else. That copy of Spider-Man is not as desirable as the same copy that I actually managed to put in a shoebox and did not stomp on all over the whole time. And eventually, bags and later on boards were discovered, and then comic books started surviving long enough to actually become something that you could actually buy later on. Well, comic grading came around as a concept, really, I'm going to say, with the first edition of the Overstreet Comics Guide. So, roll that story back, what does that make it, 50 years now at this point? Interestingly, though, the Overstreet Comic Guide version 1.0 only had 3 grades for comics. It's very similar to what Amazon does with used books. They had mint, fine, and good. That was it. That was the whole grading system for comics. Now, it got more involved over time, but, think about, comics that, or not comics, but books that you buy on Amazon. Is it new? Is it used like new? Is it very good, or is it acceptable? I think that's the entire grading system on Amazon for used books. And most of us can kind of cope with that one. Now, later guides, Overstreet, we have the classic Overstreet grades. I believe there were 8 of them in total. They ranged from poor to mint existed, but it became clear that mint was sort of a theoretical concept like perfect love. It was something that you would dream about but never achieve. Near mint became like the effective top of the scale. And then we had fine, very good, blah, blah, blah. And there were about 8 grades in total in the whole thing. And I'm going to say most of us, if we had any kind of background in paying attention to what the grades are, and so forth, could kind of cope with that. It's like you could have a good faith argument as to whether something was in fine or very good, but there's enough of a difference between the two that if you sit there and say, no, man, you're saying this is fine, but look at the half-inch or more corner bend over here that is color breaking, so clearly that puts it into very good condition. I mean, you could point to specific defects that would knock it into one grade or another. That got more involved as comics got more valuable, as people got more professionalized in the whole thing. You started having split grades and half grades and so forth, and eventually I remember there came the time. Well, I do want to say you could arbitrate most of these disputes in person, because that was the only way you would actually encounter a comic book. You would ask the guy to, hey, can I see that copy of X-Men 101? Take it down from the wall, and he'd be like, look at you and say, is this guy going to get his grubby fingers all over it and smudge my copy of it? And if your fingers look sufficiently clean, he'd be like, okay. He'd gently take it out of the bag, hopefully he hadn't taped it, and you'd sit there and leaf through the whole thing. You'd agree on what the grade was, and you'd move on and decide whether it was worth whatever he was asking for. you could arbitrate the the condition disputes because you were seeing the book in person. Well, all right. So along comes the early internet, and not long after the early internet came eBay, and suddenly we're all buying comic books, and they're based off of a description some guy's got. Maybe he took a picture, it's on some smudgy little webcam or something like that, or his Motorola cell flip phone or something. And he would say, "Oh yeah, this is in very fine, or it's mint condition." And you'd look at the thing, and it'd be creased and spine roll everywhere. And you'd be like, "Oh, go to hell, you jerk!" And eventually it got very confusing as to what the grades really were, because on one hand you have a well-established set of grades that all the comic collectors knew about. You had a whole ton of people who were trying to unload junk on eBay, and who either didn't know or didn't care. Nobody's going to really hold them accountable except when the sale went wrong and you were disputing to eBay about the condition of the whole thing. And into this whole realm entered a company called CGC. Now, I remember sitting there with Maggie Thompson one year at a comic convention, and she's talking about, yeah, there's a company. This is now in the late 90s. It's like, yeah, they've been doing this for a while in the coin realm. It's like a thing. Krause Publications, the parent company of Comics Buyer's Guide at the time, dealt with a whole lot of collectibles. So she was wise to what was happening in things outside the comic realm. This was all new to me. She's like, yeah, they've been wrapping up coins and everything. They put them in a little sealer, and that way you can't mess up with the oils from your hands, but you can look at it on both sides, and it's got a little thing at the top that says what grade it's in. It uses some kind of decimalized scale. It seems very scientific. And people are paying like multiples of what the coin would go for without the seal, because it was in this very scientific looking package. And she says, well, these guys are moving into comics. I'm like, what? Comics? Why do we need this? Because I'm sitting there thinking anyone with non-grubby fingers is allowed to open the comic book and look at themselves, and surely adults can agree on what the value is. Plus, there was a problem. A key feature of this scientific grading thing is that you'd take the thing once it was there, you'd seal it in a plastic crypt, which it could never be opened without destroying the value of the whole thing. And you'd put a sticker on the inside of the whole thing, which had the value of the entire book, but the whole thing was a sealed package, so it could never be tampered with, and it was a bit more rugged, so that part was good. Bad news is, you could then never touch, read, interact with in any meaningful way the comic book. It was now on permanent display like a stuffed animal, but it was never going to be your faithful dog anymore. You were never going to interact with the thing that made it a comic book in the first place. So I'm thinking, well, I don't know, man. I don't know. I mean, we'll see if this thing catches on. Well, as we all know, it caught on in a big way. It started out, with a few folks to start with. It was originally, sold only through comic retailers, through a special affiliates network. You had to submit to your comic retailer, who would then forward them on to CGC. Eventually, it became something where you could ship it to them directly, and you bring them to comic shows. And then this thing came in where everyone figured out, and CGC would actually take ads out to this effect, that there's gold in them thar hills, where as soon as I take a random comic book and I stick it in a CGC sealed envelope, or a sealer, or a slab, as we call them, the same comic that 2 minutes ago we all agreed in was, say, near mint, right? I look at it, you say, this is near mint, you say, that's near mint. Yep, absolutely, near mint. And if I sit there and I sealed it in one of these things, and I stuck a sticker on it that said 9.4 near mint, but it was in one of these things, suddenly it still might be near mint. The label still says that, but it would suddenly sell for 4 times what the unslabbed copy would sell for. Now, you look at that for a while and you sit there and say, come on, these people are nuts, right? I mean, what kind of idiots are doing this? And then when everyone's doing it, it seems to be a market for it, then suddenly all of us want to get on board, and suddenly CGC is backlogged by months and months and months because people are sending in so many submissions to the whole thing. Well, fast forward a little while to the whole thing. Anything that looks like you're printing money is never going to stay the province of one person for a while. Oh, by the way, I should also point out that there was a great deal of theater, especially in the early days of CGC, where the principals would show up and they'd have white film handling gloves as they went on there. They'd all be wearing suits. They'd be the one guys at the whole comic show with suits on. They came off like art appraisers. They would very carefully lay your comic book out there, very delicately initial all the submission forms and everything else, and there'd be a ginormous 73,000-pound old school bank vault behind them that after all the official forms had been signed and everything else, your order would be carefully transported into at the show. It was, and all the talk in the trade at that point was all about Oh yes, yes, they have a whole facility for doing the grading, and it's a clean room, and all the analysis is all done by all these trained experts in the whole thing, and they photograph all the submissions every step of the way, and it sounded like an Intel chip factory in terms of the way that they portrayed the whole operation. It was crazy. Anyway, so for good or for bad, it caught on. And then, of course, there people had to follow. The first of the people to follow in any big way was a company called PGX out of, God, I want to say Utah? Oregon? Somewhere up there. And then later on, I guess Steve Borak, one of the OG guys from Comics Guarantee Corporation, CGC, also who was I want to say the submissions director for Heritage Auctions. But an old school comic guy, through and through, well respected. Apparently some kind of tiff with CGC. He left and said, well, heck with that, I'm going to form my own place. And he formed the Comic Book Guarantee Service, CGCS. Someone will tell me what that stands for, but CBCS, I believe. And they are now a third competing brand out in the market for comics. And I have no doubt there are others. But those, when you look at things like eBay and who's got market cred, it seems like the pecking order at the moment, and this is my unscientific opinion, but based on just internet comments and how people seem to be valuing things on eBay and such, is CGC seems to be the OG, the big man of the room. If a CGC grade that's the gold standard, that's the one you want. CBCS, I'd say, is right behind it. PGX, for some reason, not getting a lot of love out there in the market. There was some early talk about how they thought the PGX was overgrading. So I have a little bit of that reputation. I don't know how much it holds up in reality, but nevertheless, I do think if you just look at internet comments, that reputation persists. So if you sit there and you have a comic book that is officially, say, 9.2, and it's 9.2 from CGC, that one's probably going to get the best price. CBCS probably the second best price. PGX probably significantly less, but they're all way ahead of an unslabbed, near mint minus comic, which would be the equivalent grade. So that's where we went, and I do remember kind of a prophetic comment from Maggie Thompson at the time, because I'm just mystified at the whole idea. Like, why would anyone slab comic books? It sounds dumb. She's like, yeah, this is going to change things. I've seen this happen in coins. It set the entire market on its ear. It's going to be, you won't believe the changes it's going to bring, and man, did she have that right. So Maggie, if you're watching, you called it right. Anyway, now, I mentioned that they had a lot of theater involved with their whole operation. And actually, before I go into this rant, let me do a quick check of comments, because I see them rolling past, and I'm trying not to let them get too far out ahead of me and everything, but it is a struggle. So bear with me on this one. Let's see what we got here. Myke says everything old is new again. Manufacturing collectibles is all new. See the Franklin Mint. Yeah, I'll probably be getting into that as well. Yes, axiology. Oh my God. Yeah, there you are, man. Yeah, okay. Okay, PGX is Eugene, Oregon. All right, according to Oro. Thank you very much. All right. So, anyway, I mentioned they have a lot of theater to the way that they were carrying out their business, and they said of what they were bringing to the table for, what seemed like an amazingly large amount of money to pay to have a professional look at a comic book. He said, wait, I couldn't just have my local comic retailer who's really good with these things. I can't just have him look at it and say, it's a very fine minus book. No, I'm going to actually pay you like $50 and then wait a month and a half to get something back which says it's very fine minus from you. What the heck are you bringing to the table that's worth this? Well, they claim to be bringing a number of things. One is they claim to have impartiality. They didn't have a dog in the race because they didn't sell comic books themselves, so they were an uninterested person. Whereas if I was bringing my comics to the local dealer and I say, well, hey, what do you think of this collection? I bring them up. Your local retailer, if he's a jerk, and a scoundrel, might have an incentive to undergrade your books buying them and overgrade them selling them. That's, let's face it, we've all seen that guy. We've all met that guy. These guys would give you a fair and impartial grade. It was part of the entire explicit promise of what they did. Another thing they did is they claimed to be experts in detecting restoration. Now, what's a restoration? So The idea of, if this was a 14th century painting, is that you probably over the years the paint would have cracked, it would have faded in the light, it would have been mishandled and knocked about, and bad things would have happened to it. And restoration for a painting actually means that somebody went in there and not only cleaned the thing, but actually probably in many cases went and painted right over the top of it to kind of patch in the areas that were starting to crack off and fall apart. And if it's done very well, it looks a lot like the original. If it's done very badly, you see cartoonish versions of Modigliani or something like that, which suddenly turned into like, it looks like Martha Simpson, or Madge Simpson. I've seen some very famous horrific restorations where like 3 or 4 layers of artists painting over the original just turned the whole thing into just a joke from what the original was. With comic books, look, we've all had the urge. I'm sure at some point we were a kid and someone had taken our copy of Spider-Man and bent a corner over and he sat there and said, well, I see the corner break, but it's against a black background and I have a Sharpie. So I'll bet you if I was, delicate about it, I could just color in the part where it was done, bend it back, and no one would know, right? Look, right or wrong, we've all thought about doing it, whether we ever have. Now, obviously, people with more talent than us and better tools and who aren't just kids could do a much better job of restoring the comic book. You could replace, rusted staples. You could, paint back in areas, that had a little color touch-up that needs doing. There are different ways of cleaning the comic book. Originally there are ways that it would involve water or some kind of solvent. There are other ways that are called, dry cleaning. By the way, in case you were wondering, dry cleaning for your clothes is not dry. It's only called dry cleaning because you're bathing your clothes in a big solvent of which isn't water, and so somehow they get to call that dry cleaning. But yeah, the reason your clothes smell different when they come from the dry cleaner is because they've been bathed in chemicals. Dry cleaning for comic books is supposed to mean nothing wet ever touched them. Period. It actually is meant to be dry. So just important difference on the whole thing. But there are different types of restoration. There's amateur restoration, there's professional restoration. Obviously, the pros are supposed to be better than the amateurs. The kids with the Sharpies are not considered very good in general. They could be downright awful, or maybe they were obscenely talented. You don't know, but a professional restorer, then there got to be names in the business where, oh yeah, this guy down in Orange County, yeah, he's really good. He touched up my copy of Avengers #2. It looks like new. It's, and so they would actually put down the names of the restorers on the whole thing, if they're honest. If they're not honest, they would say, hey, it's my Avengers #2. It's in near mint minus condition. And restoration? What are you talking about? Never heard about it. Who's this Orange County guy? That game would happen. So one of the things that CGC would allegedly do is they'd get out the black lights or do whatever they had to do to detect restoration, and they would actually tell you, hey, there's a color touch up here on page 6. I bet you didn't know that, but so I'm going to note it in my notes, and so I can only give you a restored grade for the whole thing. I'll tell you, it's apparently very fine minus. It's not really very fine minus because someone took out some ink. They took out some, they did something which, either added or removed from the original comic, so it's considered restored. So even though it looks really good, it's not the original thing in its entirety, and it's considered considerably less valuable. Which, by the way, that opinion seems to be changing with modern auction results, which is an interesting thing to watch. If you're watching the heritage things, it used to be the restored books, no one would touch them. They were like the reading copies of your nice comics. You're like, yeah, I got the Batman 1 finally, yeah, but it's only a restored copy. And someday I hope to have an unrestored copy. But when Batman #1 suddenly got to be $1 million book, or almost $1 million book, suddenly that dream fades and your restored copy starts looking pretty damn good. Anyway, so that's where restored copies are getting, is we start seeing more of them, and the restoration is really being done fairly professionally these days. A lot of money's on the line, and they're getting really much more accepted at auction. So they're not the black sheep they once were. It's an interesting thing to see. Anyway, but they were there to tell you whether something had been restored. They would look at signatures. Later on, one of the later services that came around with services like CGC is they would tell you, hey, the signature, which is allegedly, Jim Steranko, I'm looking at the S here. According to our graphologists, that, this does not appear to be Jim Steranko's actual signature. It's some dude who, it could be your buddy who signed for him. And so they would, in theory, authenticate signatures so they would become more valuable. Later on, they got into the game where they would actually just do what Joy Von Wade does, where they just hire the guy and they'll take a piece of the action and they'll just watch him sign, as you do it, and they'll do that as part of the signing event. But that was part of the original premises. They would tell you whether the signatures were fake. They'd tell you whether the book was fake, and so forth. It is interesting, on the other hand, that again, the CGC went originally from detecting whether the signatures are real to just getting in the game and making their own. So, we'll get to that in a bit. And then finally we get to pressing. So let's talk about a little bit what pressing is. Pressing is the one form of, it's a thing that's like restoration, but it's not. And all the way back to the Overstreet Pricing Guide, the first time they ever talked about what constitutes a restoration on a comic book, pressing, which is the idea that you take a comic book that is not flat and you, using various machinations, but mostly force, make it flat again. That, because it's done the way it's mostly done, adds nothing to a comic book and takes nothing away from the comic book, is not restoration, right? So the main, so the idea that you took a wrinkled comic book or a comic book with bends, or dimples or things like that, and you made it, flat again, could add a lot of value to the comic book in a way that not only is it not detectable, but it's not considered cheating. And so pressing has always kind of been legit. Now, certain services are trying to make it a little bit more not legit, but honestly, I think that ship has sailed. I think the original stance of did you add or remove anything from the comic book, I think that's where most collectors stand on the whole thing, and I don't think they're in an urge to move. But let's talk about what that looks like, because it's interesting. Got some graphics for that somewhere. Okay, so I'll hit those ones in a second. So what you guys should be looking at here is a couple of graphics. If you look at the one on the left there, and this is CBCS advertising their own pressing service on the whole thing, you can see that they can really, really knock out the, let's see, that graphic doesn't look like it came up. Give me just a second. There we go. Okay, that should be on the screen now. You can see that one really makes a difference in terms of the before and after, in terms of removing the foo on the comic book. An even better example is this one right here. So the Marvel Spotlight, if you're reaching Werewolf by Night, where you see the huge bends in the corner on the top one. Really, you can just annihilate them. You can make this thing perfectly flat, and it does bump the grade by a fair amount. Now, if you're talking about in some cases you're talking about $1 million books or $100,000, $200,000 books, bumping the grade up by 1 or 2 notches is money. I mean, this is a really serious amount of change involved in doing this sort of thing. So it's become something which was sort of interesting but theoretical for most people lately. And I'm going to say, as CGCS and CGC, CBCS, and PGX have started to dominate the high-end market for these sorts of things, and honestly, as the pricing has really gone through the roof on these sorts of things, tons and tons of amateur and not amateur pressing services have gotten into the game. And so the internet is full of information on how to do this yourself. There are a number of guys who will do a much better job for you. What the basic mechanics are. So if you look at CGC's, CGC bought a company called, let me look for it, I think it's called CCS, that did pressing. They claim that what they do is a trade secret. No one could ever figure it out. It's beyond human ken, etc. What it really looks like is something very similar to this. This is a heat mat press. They use this one for t-shirts. You can buy them on eBay for like a couple $100. This is the nicer version, same idea. The idea is you can apply humidity if you want. You can put it in a humidity chamber. You can sometimes flash heat the whole thing. It's basically force plus possibly a bit of humidity, plus some patience and some a bit of skill to make things not stick together. There is a whole guide on it that I've linked in the show notes, which I found fascinating reading. I do think it's well worth checking out. It's as well as reference to a couple books on the subject. And I spoke to a guy before the show because I wanted to get another person's opinion, a guy named Chris Myers, who works as the comicbookpresser.com. Seems like a pretty straight shooter. I've used him personally for my own books. His portfolio page is amazing. In terms of books that he's gotten in, that he's gone to work on, and what the end results are, night and bloody day. For certain types of defects. I mean, look, if the next door neighbor scribbled all over the whole thing, he can't help you. But if he ran over it with his bike, there's a decent chance. The ideal for these sorts of things is a non-color breaking bend of some sort. They can usually, it looks like, put that back, and it gets more complicated when the book is older. The paper stocks changed over the years. There bad things happen to paper over the years. Although newer paper stocks, especially ones that involve gloss or any kind of chromium or Marvel digital codes or special printing techniques, they have their own set of challenges on the whole thing. But yeah, you absolutely can dramatically raise the quality of the overall book over time through the careful application of these sorts of techniques. If you want to get into the whole thing, here's a quick list of the sorts of things you will want to have if you really want to go full tilt on this whole thing. It ranges from the, latex gloves and Teflon sheets to little bone tools for pushing out dimples by hand and so forth. There's a whole range of craft to this whole thing, and I would have to say this thing is obviously a skilled craft. It is something that, again, having talked to Chris for a while, it's something where you might want to try it yourself on that $20 copy of Spider-Man you beat up back in the 70s, which if you pressed it right might become a $30 copy of Spider-Man. Don't start out at your $2,000 copy of Avengers #1 or whatever the thing is. There are people who are more skilled at this than you are. If you do it wrong, you will mess up your book. But there's a good chance that you can do, again, miracles on the whole thing and not be considered cheating. So that's a thing. It was interesting to find out more about it. And again, check out the show notes if you'd like more information on how pressing works and what it might or might not do for you. But anyway, the thing I'm getting into now is we've got all these ways of altering comic books now. And they ranged from the idea of, I'm going to take a comic book and we all knew restoring it is some level of cheating. It's some level of artistry, but it might be good or bad. We can press it, we can make it flatter, we can do other things to our comic book. By applying a certain amount of money and time and patience and whatever else, I can turn it into a better version of itself. Much the same way that, like, a woman who looks quite good might put on a bit of makeup and look really good, right? Anyway, we do have a problem where, because of the way the money has flown in this whole end of things, I'm going to say, and I don't want to slander or anyone in particular, but I'm going to carefully say this, but with some conviction. I do think there's a corrupting influence at work with the way this whole thing is set up. And just imagine, if you will, if this were any other business and it had this arrangement of fees and incentives associated with it, would you feel like the whole thing was 100% on the up and up or not? So, first of all, I want to be very careful about my words on this one, because again, I can feel the band hammers and this and the lawsuits coming. So when I talk about what is corruption, right? So quite literally, corruption is kind of 1.5 meanings, right? The main meaning is you take something that's moral and straight and you turn it into something kind of evil and bent, right? But it has another meaning which might be even more appropriate on this one, which is to say, you take something that has a nature, right? A telos, right? And you turn it into something that has a different nature, and prefer one that's a bit darker, right? So if I take a comic book, right, I could corrupt it by taking away the thing which makes it a comic book, right? And I do think that there is a factor of that, but I also could take something that is an enjoyable hobby and I could corrupt it a bit by turning it into something that is nothing but money. And especially if the money is based on a little bit of shadiness. And by shady, let's talk about some of those things. So there are, for lack of a better word, a number of conflicted interests that have aligned in this whole space. First of all, let's talk about my field for a bit. You know, these things always come off as more credible when you talk about the things that make you look horrible first, right? That's when, by the way, hint for all people who want to tell a lie. You know, it's like the best way to tell a lie and get away with it is tell a lie that makes you look like bleep, right? Because if you say like, oh yeah, you say that, people will believe it because they would, you know, basically they consider an argument against interest, so obviously it has instant credibility. Well, one of the things I learned early on in doing ComicBase is it occurred to me that, well, okay, I want to do comic software, but I need a price guide. All right, so we tried to make a number of different licensing deals with different people for various reasons. They never quite came off, and so I wound up having to, you know, start doing my own research. And in the end, we wound up devising our own price guide. We made a deal with the Comics Buyer's Guide and so forth. One of the early conversations we had with the Comics Buyer's Guide is we talked about, man, we're trying like crazy here to research, you know, what would a smart person with some choice pay for all these comic books, right? That was our pricing stance when we did it. And as close as we got to the whole thing, I would keep getting calls like this. They would call me up and say, like, okay, yeah, well, you know, you guys suck. Your pricing's all wrong. I say, oh, geez, man, sorry to hear it. Tell me when I'm wrong about. Well, look at Jack of Hearts #1. Are you talking about the Marvel '84 miniseries? Yeah, that one. And it's like, okay, what about it? Well, you say it's worth $4. Okay, what's the problem with it? I mean, I'm looking at that, you know, double check eBay, double check a few other things while I'm online with the guys. Like, oh, I'm seeing points all around there. It's like $4 looks like a pretty damn good call. Yeah, but I only buy things for half guide, and I want to be able to sell them for more than that. So you can't say it's $4. I'm like, what? You just told me I got the price bang on the money, and you're yelling at me? What the hell? And again, the first time you get a call like that, you think the guy's nuts. It's a one-off, but then you'd keep getting the call. Well, one thing you learn after a while, if you ever have occasion to make a price guide, is if you want to be a popular price guide, there's a lot of incentive to you to tell people their books are worth more than they are, right? If I simply just took all the prices from last year, added 12%, took the spreadsheet and copied down and to the right, I'd be done in, I think, in an hour for all the pricing for the year, and everyone would be happy, and it would take people years to figure it out. Unfortunately, I didn't do that because I'm an idiot. And because I thought, well, that's wrong, right? I mean, I'm looking at copies of my own Conan the Barbarian that have price tags from the 70s on them that I still haven't sold at their 1970s prices for this long. Clearly, some things are wrong. You got to find the market, you know, they call it the market clearing price, right? But that's a really good way to have an unpopular price guide. Well, okay, so I learned that one the hard way. Well, let's talk about how to have a popular or unpopular grading service, right? Well, one thing is, if you tell everyone their books are crap, right? You know, if you were the hardest grader on the planet, and you know, it's good for your credibility, which is a good initial strategy, certainly to start with. But I think as PGX discovered, you can go the other way and say, well, but I'll be more popular if I tell them they're a little bit better than the other guys. Well, reputation is huge in this whole thing. So PGX actually had the incentive. They say, well, if we're a little bit looser on the grading than CGC is, at least this is. I'm not saying they did this. I'm just saying that's the rap on them a little bit, and you can substitute any two companies. If you wanted to separate Company A from Company B, if Company A said, I'll be a little bit looser than Company A, you know, then I might get a little bit more love from people because they know that they could send their books to me, and I'll give them, you know, I'll give them a better grade. There's more money in it for them as long as people still accept my grade and believe it. So it's a conflict. You got to manage that conflict, and the thing that really helps you keep that one straight is just having an unshakable reputation. I do think there's at least one company in the field that is having some difficulties that because of some initial moves they did where they were seen as not being as strict. So that's reputational. Well, okay, that's one. Another problem you've got is that the grading companies control the supply of grades. One problem I have when I look at a 10.0 grading scale is I sit there and say, okay, what do you mean by 10.0? And they say it's perfect in every way. It's perfectly printed, it's perfectly bound, it's perfectly aligned, it's been not, you know, there are no defects on it in any way. I'm thinking, so how does that not describe most of the comics that ever roll right off the printer into their first shipping box? I mean, I've seen modern printing processes. I mean, you can have things go wrong, certainly, but most things, they won't pass press check. They won't pass customer acceptance unless they're perfectly aligned, they are perfectly trimmed, they are perfectly printed. I mean, why then could I not go to Brenner Printing or whoever, Quebcor or whatever else, and say, hi, I want the first 5 boxes of Spider-Man that roll off your press before anyone else buys them. I just want them, and you will pack them in my shipping box, which is perfectly insulated and whatever else. And shouldn't I, out of those first 500 copies of Spider-Man Name Your Issue, shouldn't I expect that 450 of them would come back as 10.0s? Right? I mean, I can legitimately find no human handling. I can legitimately find no defect at all in the whole things. And yet, if I actually sent them off to a grading company, I'd get 2 or 3 10.0s tops. I'd get a bunch of 9.8s. I'd get a whole bunch of 9.6s, and a few 9.4s. Just the way it is. And you sit there and say, well, why did I not get 10.0s the whole time? I've never heard a sufficient answer to it. You can imagine a defect, but according to their own standards, it's like, I just didn't feel like it was perfect enough. 10.0s are a jackpot grade. They're literally the grading equivalent of 3 cherries coming up on a slot machine in Vegas. So if you got a 10.0, we figured out at one point it had a 28-time near mint bonus factor associated with it, because there are fanatics in the world who have got to have the most perfect copy of whatever the book is. It doesn't matter, of Dazzler #1, right? And as a result, for something that actually says 10.0, that 10.0 is worth money, right? Well, okay, you're a grading company. You know that thing's worth money. You know that people keep coming back till they get that money. There's a lot of money riding on them getting it. Are you going to give them out based on purely on grade, or are you maybe going to constrain the grades a bit? I'm just going to say, I find it statistically anomalous that brand new comics that have never been touched by anything but gloved human hands, that the rate of 10.0s is so vanishingly small. But I do see a number of business reasons why that might be so. I don't see a lot of actual, in the real world reasons why that should be so, if all we're really doing is talking about grading. Another problem is, we talked about potential conflicts of interest, is there's a whole issue of what am I really delivering when I grade a comic, right? And I've said before, and I'll probably say it 4 more times before the end of the show, what you are doing when you take a comic book and you send it off to be slabbed is you're taking a raw material, a comic book, you're adding money and plastic and a label to it, and you're turning it into a new collectible with just different properties. One of the properties it has is that it's hard to destroy. One of the other properties, unfortunately, it has is that it's impossible to open, so you can it no longer has the properties of being a comic book anymore. You're not going to get any more story than is found on the front and back covers at that point. But anyway, the people who buy these seem to have voted and says, well, I like the new collectible. I like the new collectible so much more that the comic market for used things of this era absolutely exploded, both in value and number, since the advent of professional grading. These things are much more merchantable than old comic books were before grading, and so that's a good thing. So people who honestly don't even have to like comic books much, it might even help if you don't, are drawn to collecting certified comic books. But it does raise a question of, well, what did I do, when I took that comic book and graded it, what did I really buy? And I think one of the most interesting examples of this is, here's a Supergirl, 1994. Hey, 9.8, pretty good, right? This got sold to me by a guy. This is one of 2 CGC comics I own. I was actually surprised I owned 2, but somehow I wound up with a Batman of some sort. I had no idea how I got it. But anyway, this one over here, I remember how I got it because a guy came up to me and was asking me back in the early days of of the 90s about what I thought about these grading services, and I said, it goes some shorter version of what I've just said now. I said, well, I get why you'd want one, but I'm skeptical about the whole thing, and I would kind of like want to see how it all plays out. And he said, well, I said, well, on the other hand, having an expert grader on the whole thing, that's definitely a bonus for a lot of people. And he pointed out, and I looked at it ahead of time, and it's going to be impossible to show on camera, that this thing, despite its 9.8, right? Sorry, I hope yeah, 9.8 over here. I'm looking at everything in reverse on the camera, so if I point to the wrong label, that's it. But 9.8, despite that, it has foxing and water damage right here. Horrific foxing and water damage, which you can see through on the back, there and there. He brought it over to the folks at the CGC booth, and because he just bought it from some guy who was selling these, and he said, "Guys, what the bleep? This thing, you just gave it a 9.8, and it's got all this water damage on the back. You can see it right through the sleeve." And the guys at the CGC booth gave, I thought, the most telling answer I've ever heard to this one. It says, "What's your beef? It's got the 9.8." And his problem was that it's not the thing you said it was, right? It is effectively counterfeit, if you remember that discussion from a couple shows back. It isn't the thing you say it is, but as far as the CGC guy is concerned, it was exactly what it said it was. It's a plastic, comic-shaped bearer bond, or comic-shaped slab, or whatever this thing is, with a 9.8 on it. He did his bit, right? It's got the 9.8. We're done. The conflict came because it wasn't the thing that, to a comic collector, it appeared to be. It had no truth to itself. But in terms of the merchantability of the particular book, once it's in the 9.8, it's got the sticker and everything else, this guy was the freak who was arguing with it. And so that I actually kind of get the CGC guy's reaction to it all. It's like, what do you want, man? It's got the sticker. It's got the sticker. It's got the number. It's intact. We got our thing. So, I do think that's morally perilous. The whole idea that you're going to send me raw materials of something I'm going to make a collectible out of. I control the one thing that matters to anyone, which is what the number on the front is. Now, if I screw up a lot, right, I can shoot my credibility in the foot. And by the way, one of my favorite scripts here, because I want to not just pick on CGC. Let me go to this one over here. There we are. Yeah. So I forget the name of this comic company. I can't read it off this one. They decided to do a retail variant of one of their books, and they wanted to make it look like one of the old EC horror novels. So they kind of did that kind of printed aging on the spine of the whole thing. And if you actually look at the comic book, it's brand new. It's $3.99. It came out like last year. Absolutely square corners, absolutely glossy, and so forth. It's just it's printed on it are some things that look at first glance like little defects. So if someone has a laugh, sent to CBCS, and they immediately returned it with a 5.5, giving it a horrific grade for having all sorts of edge defects and and weathering and things like that. So yeah, it's not just one grading service that screws up on the whole thing, but I do think you've got a problem where, on a fundamental level, they're not delivering the thing which the original deal was. That you claim that's what it is that we're doing here. That what we're really delivering is professional grading. When someone calls you out and said, "Look, you didn't give that to us," I think there's a problem there. Now, where it gets super sketch. And this is the part where I'm just going to say, look, there's a conflict of interest. I mean, I'm not saying anyone is personally morally compromised, but I'm saying if there was anyone in any other business where they were doing these sorts of things, you'd be calling for ethical standards to be instituted first thing. Number one, they're charging for their services. Almost all the grading services are charging as a percentage of value, not as a fixed fee per comic. So in other words, the people who give out the number, which determines your value, are charging you not for their time. They're not for any kind of insurance and everything else. You pay all that on the top of it, but they're charging for their stuff as a percentage of the value that you're getting. So essentially what they're really doing is they're profit sharing with you, if you will, where if you send them something very valuable and they give you a grade that makes it even more valuable, well, it's like your real estate agent, right? They're charging you that 2-3%, depending on who you're using and whatnot, and how fast you want it back, of the value of the comic, not for the professional services of doing it. It's not like we charge you $60 an hour or $150 an hour. It's based on percentage of the book itself, and the value of that is based on the thing they give you. That's a conflict. Another problem is that they started, all three of the big ones started running their own pressing services. So look at the message that they're doing here. They're saying, hey, you know what really helps your grade? Pressing the book. Hey, you know what else? We happen to run a pressing service. Imagine, if you will, that the home inspector for your house says, you know what? You could pass this inspection, but you really need some quality electrical work. My cousin has an excellent electrical work. You'd be calling the city, or the Justice Department or something on that guy. Look, for all I know, everyone is doing everything completely above board, completely moral, on the whole thing, and yet the conflict of interest is evident. I'm going to call it. This is a problem. They also start doing their own signature services. So, the Joy Van Wade thing that got me going on this whole thing to start with, the idea that you move from saying, all right, we'll be the guys who, are graphologists, are expert, they work for the FBI, are going to determine whether or not this really is Jim Steranko's signature or Jack Kirby's signature. And 2 seconds later, they're sitting there, having devised a certified signature label. All three of them are now, CGC and CBCS are both doing events where they will have their own services, where we will have somebody sign the thing, and you're not just getting it signed. It isn't like I took the book into, to a convention and you could take pictures of yourself, just like I had pictures of myself of that Billy Idol guitar being signed for me, right? It isn't like you can just do that. It's not a question of is the signature authentic anymore. Is that they've, in theory, made it so the only way that this signature will be accepted as authentic is if they say so. And they are the people who control the supply of the labels which say so. And, oh, hey, what do you know? Turns out that Jeff Johns is signing at our event. Oh, what do you know? It'll cost you a couple $100 to get his signature. So if Jeff Johns shows up at your local comic store and signs a bunch of things for you, it doesn't count, right? Those are, inauthentic. Oh, good news. For $130, we'll authenticate that signature for you, maybe. Maybe that was Jeff Johns signing it. It doesn't matter if you, the guy who owns the shop, but the suppliers of the coveted yellow sticker that says that it's authentic, yeah, those guys are the people who are also going to charge you for the signing. So I'm going to say that's a conflict. Anyway, and then finally we get the final bit where we devolve to the point where like they recruit a TV star, who is not even in the show, who plays a character that isn't even in the comic book, to sign things, which you are going to send them. They'll charge you shipping both ways, the whole thing. They supply the yellow sticker for the whole thing, and it's $230. I mean, at this point, it's very hard to make the case for this as a disinterested third party, that all they really want to do is bring professionalism to the grading of the whole thing. And this is after they've taken ads, full-page ads out in any number of trade journals, which say, "Hey, here's this comic in near mint. Here's this comic book in CGC near mint, and this one sold on eBay for $600. This one sold for $3,200." They've taken that ad out multiple times. I remember Vampirella was the one that they used on the Comics Buyer's Guide one. It's very hard to say that they're not exerting a corrupting influence on the whole thing. And anyway, look, I'd say, look, if we were going back to 1999 and Maggie Thompson's warning me this is going to change things, what would I suggest happen, right? Well, what I would suggest happen is I would say, well, clearly we're going to need some ethical standards. Honestly, I was an idiot. I sat there and said, well, come on, who's going to do that? There'll be like 3 freaks who want to get their stuff slabbed. I was wrong. It turned out that as soon as, in a fit of, thaumaturgical, wonder, we could, sit there and transmute, Supergirl #1s into gold by the magic of applying a slab to them. As soon as that became the accepted standard of the comic industry, all of us looked at that thing and we said, dude, free money. You get out your calculators, you figure out what's going to cost me to get it slabbed, and you immediately, at a certain point, you sit there and say, I'm an idiot if I don't get these things slabbed. I can make so much more money if I can, take them that way. These days, you can, go one step further and say, well, okay, I've got a comic book that's in this grade from this, these guys, but I got a CGC grade of 5.5 on it. But if I run it past a pressing company and then I submit it to CBCS, maybe I get a 7.0 out of the whole thing, and maybe the delta on that thing is worth $10 grand to me. There are people who just they live for that little game, right? And it's a really hard one to resist. If you look at comic books as something where like it's kind of like an angle, it's like it's a hustle. I know a lot about this sort of field. You can use my knowledge and make some coin on it. It's a real hard one to want to step out of, as long as you're looking at it that way. So in a way, it's like, yeah, you might say, well, this is a conflict of interest on their hand of things, but we as fans are at least as guilty, because we're the people who got corrupted first. They could not do any of this stuff if we didn't play along and look at the thing and said, oh my God, free money. So, in a way, at the end of the day, all this hassle, for good or for bad, is on us. We didn't need, they might have offered us this magic service for transmuting, worthless 90s comics into gold, but we're the people who bought it. And so, if I'm going to blame anyone, So, anyway, what, where does it end? Is I guess where I'm coming down on this whole thing. Where do we look at this whole thing and say stop? The metaphor I draw on this one is, we all have met this woman in our lives. A pretty good-looking gal. She's got a little thing. It always bugged her. And so she got a little bit of makeup to patch over whatever part of her face was bugging her, and then she feels good. And then it's a couple years later, and suddenly she's got a little other thing with her nose is bugging her, and so she's like, oh, okay, I'll go and I'll see a doctor about that one, get her nose trimmed back exactly the way she wants it, and this thing keeps on going. The years keep rolling by, and over time she's got a face that is so waxed over and Botox that it's hard to make facial expressions, and she's like some weird shape of a human being. This is like what restoration and going into the end of the whole thing looks like on a human face. We can also do this sort of thing on comic books, right? I mean, look, no one's going to fault you if you've got a comic book and you say, I'd like to make it look good. I'll stick it in a plastic bag, put a nice backing board on it. Done and done, right? Who's got a beef with that? That's crazy, right? All right, want to make it look a little better. Put it in Mylar. Maybe I'll put it in one of those sealer cases so I can display it on the wall. Cool, that's good. I'm going to get it graded. Okay, great. Grading is good. Well, okay, maybe I want to get it pressed and graded. Maybe I want to get pressed, restored, and graded. Maybe I want to, you can keep going on the whole thing. And at some point, I don't know, man, it feels like someone ought to yell stop. But as long as you can make more money taking the next step, at a certain point, it's hard to be that guy who yells stop. I mean, because if all you're doing is you're comparing the money in versus the money out on any particular play, if what you think is that I'm trading in, plastic collecto-foo, whatever these things should be called, collector-sized comic poster plastic slabs. I mean, it's hard for me to call it a comic book anymore because I can't do the one thing a comic book does, which is I can't read the damn thing. I can't, I don't know if Supergirl had a good, bad, or indifferent story on this thing. I don't know if the interior art looks like. I don't know anything about this comic book other than what the cover looks like, and I know it has 9.8, whatever the hell that is. But it stopped being the original thing that made me fall in love with comic books. So, you picked up some nice commerce qualities on the whole thing, but you lost some things that were kind of precious. So, look, at the end of the day, a lot of the complicated issues of time, people ask me, people actually call up with very complicated, more, questions about the comic world sometimes, just on the tech support line. And I kind of, at the end of the day, I just kind of go back to the same thing. It's not like, what would Jesus do? It's like, dude, what would I tell a friend? I mean, if you were like my best buddy and you were asking me what to do for selling your collection, or what would you do if you were, looking to invest in this, that, or the other thing? I'm like, well, okay, my inclination's over here, but what would I tell a buddy, right? Look, I like comic books just the way they are. I own like 2 slab things, and one of them I bought purposely from a guy who felt gypped. I had said to the guy who was like pissed off at CGC, I said, why don't you just pay for that thing? And I was like, $15. I'll buy it from you, because I wanted to have it just around, just to kind of remind me to keep humble on the whole grading thing someday. So that's why I have a Supergirl #1. I have no idea why I have a Batman, whatever the hell the thing is that I found upstairs, in my stuff. Somebody must have just given the damn thing to me. But anyway, for me, this isn't my play. But let's say it's your play, right? Let's say you get different things out of comic books than I do, because we all get something different out of them, right? Look, if you're my buddy and you're thinking, like, I got a high-end Golden Age collection and I'm going to want to sell this someday, should I get my books slabbed? I think my advice to you would be this. I'd be, well, not right away, man. As long as you don't think they're going to go wrong on you. So as long as you've got a climate-controlled place, with mylar around them so they're not going to get, decayed by their own backing boards and all the other standard preservational things you want, I would keep my options open for them to still be comic books as long as I humanly could. Because there is something, to me, that's magical and cannot ever be equal to opening up an old copy of Black Hawk and just carefully leafing through the whole thing and saying, like, man, I can imagine being a kid back in 1952 or whatever and reading the same thing when it, both it and I were younger, and feeling whatever that kid experienced as you read this whole thing. It's something I can't get just reading the thing on the screen. I'm interacting with history in a really special and personal way that can't be matched any other way I know. I love interacting with old things. You got to do it carefully. Again, we all learned very early on, don't bend the pages back and all the other things that go along with handling old things. But I mean, look, there's a reason we don't all visit museums online. There's a reason we want to look at, millennia old structures and, and handle, old objects and things like that and just connect with history. It's personal, it's human. I'd say as long as you can keep those attributes of the object, do it, right? Keep that in your life. If you fear that they will go away on you, if you fear that, no, I live in Florida, the humidity is terrible, I'm worried about storage, I'm worried about what else, you know what, if you gotta, go ahead and get them slabbed, get them stored away safely in a storage locker, whatever you gotta do to preserve your money and the whole thing, do it when you gotta do it. But I'd say until the moment where you gotta convert it into cash, keep the attributes that made you fall in love with it in the first place. Keep the thing that made it a comic book. But when it is time, and there will come a time with all the things in our life where we want to convert them from the thing they were into something else that suddenly is more useful to us. It's funny, I play a number of like board games like that where you have one type of asset like, wood, or, I'm thinking of Kaptain or something like that where, I can take X many red gems and convert them to green gems. I need the green gems in order to buy the other thing over there, but all the conversions always come at a cost. I look at comics like that. It's like, yeah, you've got the ability to convert them from one form to another at a cost. The cost when you go and you convert them into this to start with is you pay, $20 and a bunch of your time and, a bunch of shipping and things like that. And I gain the ability of indestructibility. I lose the ability to ever read it again. And if I want to, convert it back again, I can throw away the $20. I can crack the thing open. I get the comic book back, right? But I've lost whatever the special attributes of this were. You can convert between forms. I would wait until you were ready to convert it into money before I started playing the grading game on these things. Unless you need to know what the thing's worth for insurance, or you need to know it for some kind of thing where suddenly it stops being an emotional object to you and starts being a financial object to you, I would leave it in its original form as long as possible. That is my take. Yours may vary. All right, so that's that. Thank you so much to Chris Myers, Comic Book Presser, on this one. And now let's hit some chat, and then I'm going to try to wrap it up. Thanks for holding with me on this one, guys. I realize this is a little long, but, I want to get off my chest. And next time, I'm not going to talk about any of this stuff. We'll talk about ComicBase. All right, so let's see what we got going on here. Steve, sorry, I gotta go to the chat that actually displays things on screen. Steve says, slamming with a third-party grader is great when buy online. Know what you get. However, it should only be a little more than normal price to cover the cost of slabbing. I agree. It's a lot of what you're doing. It really comes down to the perceived value of the grading service. I mean, what you're doing is you're adding the slabbing company's reputation and their value to your own. To the value of the book, and so that's part of what you're buying. So it's funny because you also see that the grading companies factor that into the prices they charge. PGX knows they're not as hot as CGC, and so they're charging less. If their reputation got to be as dominant as CGC's, I would expect that the price would go exactly to where that one is as well. Oro says, can I use my mom's steam iron to press my books? Ha ha ha. Looked into this. No, you can't. It's actually one of the best ways to ruin anything. So no, steam irons are out, but matte presses apparently are that's your friend. Do read the restoration guide on the whole thing. And by the way, if you ever steam press a chromium book, apparently you will wind up with an ungodly mess. So just keep that in mind. John P says lipstick on a pig, possibly. Okay. Questions about the type of plastic. We'll probably get into this at some point. As Greg points out, some types of plastic are inert, some aren't. Polyethylene, polypropylene, not inert. They degrade slowly. Polyethylene kind of turns into this glue-like substance. If any of you guys remember polyethylene bags, they all got very kind of slimy over long periods of time. Polypropylene bags tend to kind of dimple and bubble, and they both turn slightly acidic, and acid is really the enemy of paper. Where paper breaks down, where comic books just become dust, is when they reach a certain age of paper decay, where they just fall into a million pieces, and then they're worth nothing. So, despite everything, there is an end of days to all this stuff. I remember, and I looked for it. I know I sold the book, but there was a mystery novel I read once. I want to say they were called like comic time capsules or comic capsules or something like that. But it was basically they were making fun of CGC, and the guy's whole scam was that he would take a cover, and then he'd put just garbage stuff as the inside filler on the whole thing, and he would say, "Oh no, they're filled with a super nitrogen depleted substance. You can never crack the seal. You crack the seal, you'll destroy the whole thing instantly. I can't be held responsible." I would not be at all surprised if someone actually got into something like that in the end. I do believe I heard something about the Declaration of Independence, like some hundreds of years old documents that are genuinely valuable. There's valuable like Action 1, and there's valuable like some of the original copies of the Declaration of Independence. I do believe those are actually gas-filled. All right, so what else we got going on? Sticky bees. Is there a way to develop an AI algorithm to learn how to grade consistently from high-res scan? It's funny. That's actually come up as a request, and I had a guy who actually looked into it at one point as just as a graphics problem. It was always kind of the dream. You want kind of like the grading equivalent of what we do by swiping a barcode. Is like slap this up to a scanner and say, oh, clearly based on the front cover this is a 9.8. Realistically, no. I can think of no realistic image recognition way to do that. If you had a perfect reference scan of every comic to compare it against, if you did AI neural net stuff to determine what certain types of defects were, at minimum, you'd still, of course, misrecognize things were intentionally aged or where they used styles like that. But I think, it feels super, super time-consuming, best case, against a really impossible data set to figure out, to compare against, and even then, you're grading the cover, right? What does that tell you about page 6, or what does it tell you about the other things? It doesn't, right? And there's certain structural, things like rusted spines and things like that. It's really difficult for me to imagine how that could be automated entirely. It feels like there's always going to be a human element to it. All right, let's see. Just says, heard many stories where someone didn't like their grade, cracked it open, sent back a different grade. Absolutely true. I have heard those stories as well. I've spoken to people who personally did it, and sometimes the grades come back a grade and a half higher, 1.5 higher. I have real problems look, even if you're assuming the best intentions on behalf of everyone involved in the whole thing, the idea of a 10.0 grading scale, look, the reason you call it 10.0, not 10, is because it sounds super scientific, doesn't it? It's like, wow, I'm grading things to a tenth of a point? Wow, that's amazing. Because I'm always having constant arguments with my comic dealer as to whether something's very fine or merely fine, let alone fine plus. So, wow, you guys can do it to 10.0. You must be better than all of us. Look, I think it's a marketing bit. It's not coming back consistently. People will crack open books routinely and have them come back dramatically differently. Clearly, you can have major defects that just weren't paid attention to, even when someone points them out to you, missing things like that. I think it's a bridge too far. But anytime you've got a system where someone can make money by doing one thing or another, count on every person in that system exploring every angle of it in order to maximize their own benefit to it. So, I mean, look, once you knew that that pressing was legit and it wasn't going to be considered restoration, you knew that there'd be infinity amateur pressers growing up on eBay who are now, some of them, you get the feeling from looking at their sites that a big part of what they make their money on is selling eBay, and reference links on Amazon to restoration equipment. There's going to be people working every angle of these things until they drop. You got to count on, people always playing those games. And if you think, hey, the cost for me to, crack this open, send it back in again is, $50, but, if it comes back any better, what have I lost? I'm out the $50, but if it comes in better, maybe I'm up $300. You know what? People are going to take that risk. Oh, by the way, tellingly, all of the grading services offer a pre-scan service where for a fraction of the grading price, they'll kind of like half-ass grade your books there. They say, well, okay, we'll only, we'll go through and for a certain amount, we'll flip through your bunch of your comics and we'll only go through the longer process of grading the books that look like they're probably going to come back over a certain grade. All of them will do that one. So, I mean, look, everyone's playing the angles on this one because again, everyone thinks they found the way to turn lead into gold. So everyone's but you're both being taken advantage of by the grading companies and you're taking advantage of the next person down the line. It's it's called the greater fool theory of investing. Is the idea is that, well, because I know a little bit more than the next guy, I'm gonna take the thing, upcycle it on my end, and I'll sell it to someone else for even more than I got. And that works great until someone gets caught at the end of the craze, the fad, or whatever else, holding 8,000 copies of something nobody wants anymore. That's the problem with most greater fool investing schemes, is that someone gets held at the end of the day with something where just the fire has gone out of the market. It's just the flame has faded. Baseball cards, I mean, they're gone now effectively. I mean, there's still a few that move, but man, I want to say that the price levels are down like 80% from where they were. All things have their day. These things they look like they're solid gold bearer bonds, but they ain't. So take it for what it's worth. Okay. Let's see. Weren't we told by someone long ago to collect what we read and love and enjoy and pay no attention to the man behind the curtain? Yeah, indeed. Yes. Okay, and we got to thaumaturgy. Doctrine, discussion, and supply of a study of the performing of miracles. I believe Greek roots on thaumatos or something like that. But anyway, okay, and Greg points out that once again we have a message board for all this stuff. Oh yes, and you'll never know if the Marvel Fun stamp on the inside was clipped. This is if you guys remember books from the 70s, I might have gone up to 80 or so, but I think it was just the late 70s. Marvel, God bless them, would have little, it was like little puzzle piece stamps. They think they're modeled off of like the old trading stamps you got at the gas station, if you remember back the 70s. The idea is to have a little picture like Nick Fury or Spider-Woman or whoever else, and the idea is you'd go in there and clip out, Marvel's trading stamp number A37, and then, at some point I think someone made a little booklet where you could, put them all in there. But in the meantime, you would have ruined like 37 comic books in order to clip out these little stamps. And all of us, I guarantee, if we collected comic books from that era, have at least one or two books in our collection where some jerk before us, clipped out the damn stamp. Anyway, and pieces in the book section of comics, possible to add the back cover of the books so we can have the front and the back. Absolutely. So the way we typically do front and back stuff right now is we do them as one united scan. So basically, it's the same way we would handle a flip book or a book with a wraparound cover. Is you just scan the front, scan the back. They're just done as one scan, not two. It's possible we might want to rethink that for the future if it becomes like a big thing. We're thinking about. Another thing that's interesting is you can actually take a folder. God, I hope I'm still right about this. I know you used to be able to do it, or at least I thought really hard about doing it. Sorry, guys. Sometimes you gotta realize I do a lot of programming at 2 in the morning, and there's sometimes a fine line between features that I put in the program at 2 in the morning, which I and only I know about, and features I thought about putting in the program at 2 in the morning, which I never got around to, but I thought one day it would seem like a good idea. So someone might want to try this and tell me if I'm right. But once upon a time, I swear to God, there used to be a thing where if you took, like, let's say you had a comic that was issue number 12. Now, you all know you can put 12.jpg, drag it in there, and you get a picture of number 12. If you go 12.pdf or 12.cbr, you get a little media thing, and it gives you 12. Whatever else. My recollection is that if you put more than one thing of different media types, it might even be that you could put a folder in instead of a file. It would give you a little context menu, at least I think it used to. I might not have ported that feature to 2020 now, I'm saying it out loud, where if you had both a CBR and a movie clip and a URL and a whatever else, it would give you, when you clicked on it, a little drop-down menu of what it was you wanted to see. If that feature is useful and it's not in there, someone ping me and I'll make it work again, because I think I'm not hallucinating that. I think that was actually a real feature if it's not still. I just think there was exactly one thing I tried it on. It was like a Wonder Woman thing where, you know, I had the movie clip, you know, the URL and the, you know, PDF to the comic book and the picture of the cover, and I wanted to be able to show all three. So I think that's a thing. All right. Okay, I think that is pretty much it. Guys, thank you let me just double check over here. Yes, okay, we are good. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. This was fun, and like I said, next week, something completely different. Let me know what you'd like to hear about. I don't want to talk about new version stuff in any detail until the new version is shipping, but the fact that I'm even dropping this kind of hints, I think tells you that we're getting close. And if you want to talk variants or things like that, let me know. Send me notes or put it in the comments, or as Greg mentioned, put it in the message board, and we'll hit you next time. Thanks again. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.